Hi, everyone. This is Debi Ghate with the Philanthropy Roundtable, and we are here for another edition of Can We Talk About It? Today, we have a topic that I think is not being talked about enough, as if there is more for us to talk about in 2020. Yes, there is. My guests today are going to be addressing the topic of anti-Semitism in the United States. Now, in 2020, we've had a lot of focus on racial tensions. We had a lot of reckoning type conversations across the country. But I want to remind everyone what's happened over the last few years. So in 2017, we did have those protests in Charlottesville. And when you look at the content of what those people were protesting with, you had symbols from the Nazi regime and other things that were clearly intended to remind us about anti-Semitic points of view. In 2018, we had the very tragic and upsetting synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and people were actually murdered on their way to worship and in their house of worship. And then in 2019, which I know seems like a long time ago, but 2019, the ADL released some statistics, and I think this is important for us to keep in mind, and it was a wake-up call for me to look at these statistics today. But it's true that in 2019, the American Jewish community experienced the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents in 2019 since tracking began in 1979, with more than 2,100 acts of assault, vandalism, and harassment reported across the United States. 2,100. And they go on to say that the number of incidents in 2019 increased 12% over 2018, with a disturbing 56% increase in assaults. So these are people in America who are being assaulted physically for being of a certain heritage, race, culture. All right, so we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism and make sure that this is a topic that we don't forget about, even though there are many other important topics that have dominated the news this year. So I'm really honored that I have two guests with me today. We have first Nadine Strossen, who may be a familiar face to people at the roundtable. Nadine is a professor of law at the New York School of Law, and she's a frequent commentator on all kinds of issues regarding free speech. I'm also honored that today we have with us Kenneth Stern, and may I call you Ken?
You certainly may.
Great. And Ken's work is something I've been reading about, even though he didn't know it until we met today on camera. But Ken is the director of the Barton Center for the Study of Hate. And he's written a book, which I'm going to ask Nadine to hold up, called The Conflict on the Conflict, which I cannot wait to read now that
The Conflict Over the Conflict.
Conflict Over the Conflict.
Subtitle, The Israel-Palestine Campus Debate.
Yeah.
Which I wrote a foreword.
Yes, you did.
Oh, well, okay. Well, double the reason to read the book. But no, there are some really serious issues happening on campus, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about those today. But I want to start with 2020. Here we are. We just heard these statistics from the ADL. How big of a problem is anti-Semitism in the United States today in 2020? Ken, can we start with you?
Sure. And thank you for that question. Yeah, anti-Semitism continues to be a major concern. I mean, anti-Semitism has been around for thousands of years. It's never disappeared. Sometimes we tend to look at it as, is it rising? Is it lowering? And look at it, almost as if we do the temperature. And I think we have to take a longer view and a wider view of how we think about anti-Semitism. It isn't just questions of attacks on Jews or Jewish institutions or cemeteries or verbiage. Is a larger way, at least that I look at it. You had mentioned the Charlottesville rally, and it wasn't only the Nazi flags that were there, it was the chants of Jews will not replace us. And then if you think about it, what that means is that you had protesters there. Remember, they were protesting Confederate statues. How do Jews get into that mix? Well, the white supremacy tends to look at American society as one that's white people are losing a battle to people that they define as inferior. And if you're losing to some people that you define as inferior, how could that possibly happen? And that's where classic anti-Semitism comes in. Jews somehow conspiring to harm non-Jews, Jews putting their thumb on the scales. So Jews are to blame for when things go wrong in the world. And that's been classic anti-Semitism throughout the ages, whether it was blood libel or so forth. That forms a basis of white supremacy. So one of the things that we tend to disregard is this larger framework of how anti-Semitism works. So you mentioned the Tree of Life, synagogue massacre, where the Bowers, who was the person who came in and did the shooting, was animated by his fear of immigrants coming from south of the border to the north, to the United States, when President Trump was talking about invaders and so forth. And he attacked that synagogue because there had been a meeting of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, that had helped with immigration reform and support. Nobody would think of the El Paso shooting at the Walmart of Mexicans and Mexican Americans as an act of anti-Semitism. We just wouldn't count it. It wouldn't be in the statistics. We wouldn't even think of it that way. But if we look at the ideology of the two shooters, they were almost identical. One just chose a different target than the other. So when we look at anti-Semitism as a very narrow thing, it's just about what people are saying about Jews, we don't look at the larger context of how things unfold. And one of my concerns about the present moment that we're in American society is that we're seeing much more of leaders push us into an us versus them dynamic. And that's the condition in which anti-Semitism thrives. It doesn't have to be about Jews. It could be about Muslims. It could be about immigrants. But when we see our neighbors as potential enemies and leadership talks to us in that way and seeing that it's something positive, that's the conditions in which anti-Semitism grow. And that's more of a concern to me than the ADL numbers.
Thank you. Nadine, did you want to add something to that about the current situation?
Yes, Debbie. One of the things that, as a human rights and civil liberties activist throughout my adult lifetime, one of the things that really frustrates me is increasing episodes of Jews who are committed to human rights and civil liberties being exiled from coalitions of various other minority groups or groups who are advocating for human rights. Some of these, and some of them have been well publicized, others less well publicized. And one that was well publicized was how Jewish leaders, women leaders of the Women's March, who supported, the whole civil rights, human rights, social justice agenda of that march, were excluded solely because of their Jewish identity / their so-called Zionism. And as I understand it, Zionism means supporting the notion that Israel should continue to exist as the homeland of Jewish people. Obviously, all of us, Jews, at least as much as anybody else, will dispute and debate what particular policies should be in Israel as we do in the United States. But, this fundamental tenet that out of all the countries in the world, one should not be allowed to exist because of some disputes about how it was founded. We certainly have that in the United States and many other countries in the world. And, so it's been very painful for me, especially as somebody who speaks on campus all the time, when this happens on campus, to have Jewish students feel that they have to choose between their Jewish identity, their support for Zionism, their love for the state of Israel, despite its flaws, along with every other country having flaws, that they have to choose between that and being accepted as members of campus coalitions. In the foreword that I wrote for Ken's book, with a lot of help from him, I should say, I noted one example from a campus very close to my home on the Upper West Side, namely Columbia University, where students were saying that there's now even guilt by association at a couple of removes, that the Young Democrat chapter on campus, because it did not exclude Jewish students who had Zionist leanings, that group became, quote, tainted and was being excluded from certain campus coalitions. So I'm very, very concerned about the white supremacists, as Ken says. They target Jews because they see us as somehow being responsible for advocating for human rights and rights of immigrants and rights of refugees and civil rights. I'm so proud of that legacy. But on the other hand, you get this attack from the left that, including on campus, that defines Jews as white, privileged, powerful, part of this global capitalist conspiracy. And so it's as if we are both attacked by white supremacists and attacked as being white supremacists.
Yes, I think that is very helpful to understand, Nadine, that anti-Semitism, it comes from different quarters and it's motivated by different things. I was in another conversation with someone where, in the context of dealing with how do we support Black people in the workplace and through allyship, one of my takeaways was somebody like me is both a white supremacist in some contexts, and in other contexts, a victim of white supremacy. So I understand what you're saying and can relate to that a little bit. But let's talk a little bit more about that, because there has been a lot of conversation about racism in 2020. And as Jews, I am curious how you have felt about that conversation, because it has been focused on one aspect of racism, which is what is happening with our Black community. And meanwhile, the Jewish community is facing a long history of racism through anti-Semitism. How has that felt in 2020 to each of you? Start with Nadine, maybe this time.
Oh, okay. First of all, I don't see this as a zero-sum game. Anytime there is an injustice, we really have to struggle against it. And for all the manifestations of anti-Semitism, it has not manifested itself in what led to the protests this summer, and that is disproportionate police abuse and killing of unarmed young men, by far disproportionately African American men. So that was the immediate cause. And George Floyd suddenly gave rise to a mass movement that certainly could have had justification for decades and decades earlier in my adult lifetime, certainly going back at least to the Rodney King beating in 1991. Ever since then, the ACLU, of which I was the national president for many years, had campaigns against disproportionate police abuse, including killing against Black men. I mean, that is such a serious problem. I was horrified by the tragic killing of George Floyd, but the silver lining to that terrible cloud was finally a mass movement to add some momentum to long overdue reforms. That said, I say reform advisedly, because I think some of the rhetoric was overheated, and I think ignoring concerns of the very African American communities that are supposedly being protected, namely defund the police, when There's so much evidence that African Americans in particular want more police protection against crime that afflicts them. And so we want, smarter policing, less discriminatory and abusive policing, but not no policing. So quite frankly, in that context, I wasn't thinking, well, there should be more attention to anti-Semitism. But hopefully, as we become more sensitized and implement reforms to eliminate or reduce one kind of injustice, that will sensitize us to other kinds of injustice and reforms in those areas as well.
Injustice is injustice to be fought wherever it arises. Ken, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. I agree with everything that Nadine pointed out, but one of the ironic things about the whole George Floyd reaction was I've been working since I was a law student in the 70s to deal with American Indian mascots, the Washington Redskins, the Cleveland Indians, and all those things, under the perception that bigotries, we should try to, change the scenario and see if the same rules apply, and we would have never had the New York Hasids or the, whatever, imagine the stereotypes that we would never have had, but the Indians stuff was still around. That's the one concrete thing I've seen come out of George Floyd. A lot of other conversations, but concrete change, it took that as opposed to 30 years of pushing on the merits of it to change that. So that's one sort of ironic thing about the unintended consequences that could actually be good. Second thing is, I absolutely agree with Nadine. It's not a zero-sum game. We should be looking at all these issues simultaneously, and we tend to just focus on whatever the latest bright shiny thing is, as opposed to the larger questions. So one of the sort of frustrations, to me, in terms of the current time in looking at issues of anti-Semitism, is when I look at sort of what the asks are from the organized Jewish community, which I was a part of for many years, to the the new incoming administration. And if you look at the document, one is Holocaust education, which is a good thing, but we can talk about whether that actually impacts contemporary anti-Semitism or not. Second is security for Jewish institutions, which makes sense to me given the Tree of Life. But the third thing is imposing the definition of anti-Semitism, and that's their third ask. And one can have a reasonable debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it got me to think, imagine if the Black Lives Matter movement reduced itself to saying, we want the incoming administration to propose legislation that adopts a certain definition of racism. We'd all say that's nuts. It doesn't deal with the underlying conditions, the historical parts of it, the systemic parts of it, how different institutions work, how we should think about it differently. But that's where the organized Jewish community is making its ask, and I think that's very short-sighted at the moment.
I want to talk more about this because, Ken, you left something out in that description, which is you were the author of that definition.
I was the lead drafter of it.
Okay,
yes.
You're the lead drafter of that definition. Now tell me what was the purpose of this definition originally?
Well, you have to remember back at the time of the early 2000s, at the time of the Second Intifada, there was an increase in attacks against Jews in Europe, particularly Western Europe. And there was a group called the European Monitoring Center, which is now part of the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, that tried to get a handle on this. The task was to put out data about incidents, very much like you were describing what the ADL was doing in the United States. And it put out a report that had a major point that was correct. So we have people in Bratislava and Paris and London, and there's no common denominator of what they should put into this report on anti-Semitism. So we need some commonality. And then they had a problem of saying, okay, well, let's come up with a functional definition. And they said anti-Semitism was a bunch of stereotypes about Jews. And I think the reason that they did that was they were faced with the political problem. What do you do if a Jew on the streets of Paris or London is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? And they said, well, if the person had these stereotypes about Jews and transported them to Israelis and then retransported them back to a Jew in front of them, that's anti-Semitism. But if they were upset at an Israeli policy, that's not anti-Semitism. which struck me as nuts. It's like saying if a black person was strung up from a tree in the 50s in the South because somebody had these stereotypes about blacks, that's racism. But if somebody was upset at the Civil Rights Act being passed or an action of the government, that's, the poor person's up on the tree, that's not racism. And it just so happened that there was an attack on a Montreal Jewish school in response to Israel assassinating a Hamas leader, not anti-Semitism. So that created an opportunity to have a discussion with this group and come up with a definition that included a lot of guideposts for data collection. There was also material in it about how to think about hate crimes, not to psychoanalyze somebody. Did they really hate Jews? But did they select a Jew to be a victim of a crime? So it had specific utilities. But what happened was that some groups on the Jewish right, once it was clear under the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities were protected in the Department of Education from systemic harassment, intimidation, and discrimination of a pervasive nature, they started filing suits that alleged violations of Title VI based in large measure on texts that were being taught or speakers that were coming to campus or other things that they said were violating the definition. And I might disagree with some of the speech that they were pointing at, but it was not on a campus. You're allowed to have anti-Zionist views. You're allowed to debate these ideas. And they were trying to use it as a hate speech code. So that's both the origin and where I started talking about the misuse of it, which continues to this day.
That must be fascinating when you are one of the people who, contributed to really forming that definition, to see it be taken on the context like that. I mean, Nadine, what is your view? Because these are issues that you must follow on campus. And what about the trying to define anti-Semitism this way as a means of dealing with it?
One of the reasons why I so admire and respect Ken's work and learn from it is he so well articulates two fundamental principles that are absolutely critical to my lifelong work as well. One is anti-discrimination of any sort and fighting for equality for everybody. And the other, and I'm not saying but the other, I'm saying and the other is robust freedom of speech for everybody, including people who disagree with our commitment to anti-discrimination. I am convinced from decades of studying the experience in the United States and around the world under so-called hate speech laws that even though I assume they're well-intended on the part of many, not necessarily all, proponents, though intended to reduce hatred and discrimination and stereotyping and promote equality and inclusiveness and diversity, all of those laudable goals that I totally support. In practice, not surprisingly, they end up being ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. And so the last thing I want to do in the name of fighting a particular form of discrimination, namely anti-Semitism, is to censor robust debate about really important issues such as Zionism, such as the extent of the Holocaust. I think the only way that we're ever going to reduce, potentially eradicate, who knows, but at least reduce negative stereotyping and hateful attitudes is through more expression, not through suppression. I mean, and we can look to Europe for an example, because when you were saying, Debi, the statistics of rising anti-Semitism, including violence in the United States, terrible as they are, I wouldn't want to trade places with Germany, which has some of the strictest anti-hate speech laws in the world, including against anti-Semitic hate speech. And those laws are very strictly enforced. And yet there has been rampant violence against Jews, including an attempted attack on a synagogue, which was thwarted only because of extra strong security. And such rampant anti-Semitism that I think it was a year ago, the head of an umbrella group of Jewish organizations in Germany, warned Jews in Germany that it is not safe to go out in public everywhere wearing a yarmulke, the skull cap that many Jewish men believe it's their religious duty to wear. I mean, can you believe this in Germany? And there have even been a couple of years ago, there was an attack in Berlin. I mean, we're not talking about some rural outpost in former East Germany, right, where somebody was physically attacked for self-identifying as a Jew by wearing a yarmulke. And Angela Merkel, for the first time about a year ago, appointed a cabinet-level minister against anti-Semitism. And we are seeing, I just read in the New York Times yesterday, more and more evidence of Nazis with anti-Semitic rhetoric and symbols infiltrating police departments all over the country, as well as the military and the intelligence forces. So clearly censorship is, it's hard to prove a causal relationship. There's certainly no causal, not even a correlation with reduced anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence.
Wow. Nadine, I think you have to mention your book too. I don't know if you have it in.
I didn't bring that as a book.
And I don't have it right here, but I
have it. I have it downstairs too. But Nadine, if you want to read more about this, Nadine lays this out beautifully in her book. Nadine, tell us about.
The name of the book is Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And I should mention that I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I'm absolutely convinced that the Holocaust could not have been prevented with even stronger enforcement of the very strong anti-hate speech laws that did exist in the Weimar Republic. The problems were much more profound, including not doing enough to suppress anti-Semitic and other discriminatory violence that was perpetrated by the Nazis. And that's a problem in this country, too, that there's been a lot of evidence that as for many reasons, including a lot of funding going toward so-called Islamic international terrorism, that there's been a defunding of efforts to go after domestic terrorism, which since 9/11 has resulted in much more loss of life in this country. And law enforcement at every level of government is feeling starved for adequate resources.
This is a very serious issue in the United States, and it's one that we keep taking our eye off the ball on. I really appreciate what you both said, and I want to talk about one other big area, back to college campuses, because there is a movement that if you follow the news in this world, you'll be familiar with it, but if you don't follow it, this may not be something you're thinking about. Ken, tell me what the BDS movement is on college campuses.
Okay, the BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It came out of really the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, again, tied into the Second Intifada, and the idea was to make Israel the new South Africa in terms of the approach of anti-apartheid. So it's a push to put Israel in that bubble. The boycott aspect of it has not been terribly successful. The sanctions hasn't been around. The first divestment petitions, actually Columbia was one of the first ones in February 2002. 18 years later, no college is divested. We've seen some student resolutions in support of it. But the thing that troubles me the most about this whole movement is the idea of academic boycotts of Israel, because that started in the UK in the 2005 and 2007, and the whole idea of saying that a certain segment of academics, because they're related to a particular country or their institutions there, should somehow be separate. Is anathema to the whole purpose of education. You look at ideas, not the nationality. And it underscores Nadine's point when you look at the pushback to it, right? So there was 2007, a UK university union promoted the academic boycott. the pushback in the U.S. initially was, oh, if the Brits are going to do that, let's therefore boycott British academic universities. Never would have happened. Violation of academic freedom gives away the whole idea of why the academic boycott is a problem, because it changes it to who should we boycott. I was able to work with the president of Columbia to get 400 university professors to sign a statement that was published in the New York Times that underscored academic freedom and debate. It basically said if that union was intent on dividing the academy into two, then count us as Israelis too. They would never have signed on a counter boycott. Right? So I understand the anger that people have about BDS. I understand the anger that people have about wanting to do things on campus when they see things that, like Nadine described, that were disturbing. But when you get to the idea of trying to censor and push back fire with fire, as opposed to looking at how do we increase the conversation, how do we use the academy for what it can do really well and have these engaging conversations, and to point out where we disagree, but to try to suppress is never the right thing. When I was testifying in front of the House Judiciary Committee, it was interesting to note that I and the President of America, Penn, and the head of the Association of Jewish Studies were testifying against this push to use the definition to, they were trying to push back against BDS with it too. And it was the Jewish organizational groups, the mainstream groups, that were pushing for it. And the concern was precisely that if we start going down this road of trying to censor speech and trying to stop BDS by saying you can't articulate it on campus, you're going to harm the academy, and you're going to harm, at the end of the day, Jewish students and Jewish faculty. Faculty were saying, if there are people looking over our shoulder when we assign something that's a pro-BDS thing, and they're going to talk about maybe suing us, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to teach about the shtetl. So the point is to counter speech. The point is to increase the conversation, to point out where you think hate exists and why, but never to try to suppress.
This brings me back to Nadine's earlier comment about injustice is injustice, and we fight it wherever we see it. Free speech is free speech, whether we like it or not, agree with it or not. And the way to respond is with more speech, even when it's on issues that we personally find very important. And I'm aware of the tension that you're talking about, Ken, among the Jewish organizations in terms of what do we do to fight anti-Semitism? Because this is personal. In a sense. It feels very personal. These students are put in extremely difficult situations. They are shouted down. There are all kinds of things that happen on campus that are really, really beyond normal, acceptable student behavior. So we understand that. But what I'm finding very interesting about this conversation is your commitment to the principle, that even when we are the recipients of these principles stand. Nadine, is that how you view it?
Yes, it's, boycotts are always a complicated issue from a civil libertarian perspective, because on the one hand, of course, we support your free speech right to advocate for a boycott, to decide that you are personally going to boycott certain ideas or books that you disagree with. But at some point, the pressure as a practical matter will lead to suppression of ideas. Now, it's not being done by the government, so you don't have a First Amendment lawsuit against it. But if you are concerned about the chilling of a robust exchange of ideas, then you would be very disturbed by the call to boycott a book, for example, as has happened many times in the past. And, yet to add one other wrinkle, there have been a number of laws that have been passed by states around the country.
Yeah,
I think
that
you cannot work for the government or have a contract with the government unless you pledge not to support the BDS movement. The ACLU, along with other free speech proponents, have opposed those laws. Yes, we oppose academic boycotts, but, to use that old saying, two wrongs don't make a right. And, you think about the old loyalty oaths. You could be anti-communist and still oppose the idea that people would be forced to take an anti-communist oath in order to maintain an opportunity to work for or with the government. So I think as long as we keep that lodestar of an exchange of ideas rather than a suppression of ideas as our mantra, and working within that. And one of the things that I really love about Ken's book is he describes a wonderful curriculum and projects that could be used on campus about the BDS movement, about the Israel-Palestine conflict historically and to the present day, as a way of not only enriching students' understanding about that, really important and really complicated conflict, but also enriching their understanding and their promoting their exercise of free speech and civil discourse. So if we have time, I'd love for Ken to say more about it. Hopefully some of your listeners will adopt it on their campuses.
You tell us, Ken, because because I have not read the book yet, and I'm buying it right after this interview is recorded, but tell us about the curriculum.
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, the campus is an ideal place to have difficult conversations, and
or it should be.
It should be, right? So I think students should be disturbed by ideas. I think they should welcome it. They should not try to say, okay, let's just not have ideas that unsettle. It should be a place to say you're going to be unsettled by ideas the rest of your lives. How are you going to think about this? And give students the capacity to be wrong, to try out ideas. And I think if that is the mission, it makes it much easier. And if the president and others help set that mission, it creates the opportunity. There are courses. I mean, there's one that I highlight in the book where a very brilliant professor had this idea of doing this class where it looks at the Israel-Palestine conflict from the 1880s to the 1930s. So before the Holocaust, before the declaration of the state, before 67, before contemporary events. So the guts of the conflict. And half of the course was a simulation where students had to adopt an historic character from the time of the Royal Peel Commission, where you may remember what the Brits sent Lord Peel to talk to everybody, what do we do about the mandate that we have? And the students had to be one of the commissioners or one of the people that testified, and they gave it against type. So I first found out about this when I read that there was a Pakistani Muslim young woman who became the president of the J Street student group. And she had taken this class, and she had to spend 8 weeks in the skin of David Ben Gurion. And, when I talked to her about it, she said, you think that was weird. I had an Israeli classmate who had to be the mufti, and as much of a pain in the butt as he was, I had on my side a Jabotinsky figure who was much more difficult to deal with. And when I talked to the professor who put that class together, it was interesting. She reflected back to me, and students would come in saying, great, we're going to figure out how the Israel-Palestine conflict should have been solved. And they come out of it saying, gee, now we understand 80 years after the Peel Commission why it hasn't been solved. And that's the point of education. People could come in being strong advocates on one side or the other, still believing that justice is mostly on one side or the other. But that's an educational process. There are classes that we have at the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. We have a syllabus collection. Some of them are how to have these difficult discussions, why people get so animated about these ideas, to look at some of the brain science and social psychology so we understand why we get into the buckets that we do and how to have these difficult conversations. And I think that's important. I think classes on free speech and academic freedom are critical so students understand the mission of the university and the importance, and Nadine so well articulates in her book and elsewhere about counter speech and how to think about ideas. And finally, we have too few classes on anti-Semitism, which is, we tend to say, okay, it's in the bucket of Holocaust courses, or we're going to subsume it under classes of racism. It's important to have an interdisciplinary historical approach to looking at anti-Semitism. It's a great window on other forms of hatred. I teach it as a subset of how we think about hatred. And I can tell you, when we get 2/3 of the way into the semester, and we've talked about the history of anti-Semitism in the context of how do we think about the human capacity to hate, and then we start talking about Zionism, and we start talking about Israel, it's a much easier conversation in the sense that people still have disagreements, but they're not, finding ways to weaponize things and to jump at each other, but they're really trying to unpack the ideas. And the more that we use the capacity of the institution to do what it's supposed to do, the better it'll be to combat anti-Semitism and to make everybody smarter.
That's so inspiring. But I'm so sad as I listen to you, Ken, to think about how too much of the opposite is happening on campus. When you read the just proliferating surveys that are done of self-censorship that students, faculty members, and the larger community are engaging in, the sensitive topics that they don't dare talk about include all of the topics that you just listed, including Middle Eastern politics and policies.
I mean, this is why we are holding this podcast. And we called it Can We Talk About It? Because there are too many topics that people are finding it difficult to talk about publicly. And it's been a long time since I've actually heard something on anti-Semitism, I think because our attention has been elsewhere. So Nadine, I really thank you for reminding us that this is a live issue in the United States. We have not solved it. In fact, we're going to have to put our heads together to continue figuring out how best to fight it. And the conversation we had here just reminds me how important it is to make sure that we provide a platform for these issues to be discussed, and we keep ourselves accountable, that we keep thinking about these issues too, and don't start to oversimplify and or forget. So I really thank both of you for joining me today, and we'll keep talking about anti-Semitism and what the future is, both on campus and in the culture at large. So probably not our last conversation. Ken, after I read your book, I probably will have a zillion questions for you.
Anytime.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. And Nadine, thanks again.
Many thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Look forward to seeing you both in person someday.
Someday, yes.
Yeah.